The way we talk about playstyles in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is deeply flawed. We throw around terms like combo, control, stun, or tempo so casually that they've started to lose their meaning. Just as an example, Virtual World is currently a Tier 1 deck. They have long, multi-step combos comprised of multiple special summons with the goal of ending on a boss monster or two. Sounds like a combo deck, right? And yet...
Virtual World is like a combo control deck. While it does have a lot of combo plays and does a fair amount of special summoning, it's really a control deck at heart because, let's be honest, it's just true King of all Calamities Turbo.
I don't show that to bash Simo, but rather to illustrate that these arbitrary distinctions between decks have a lot of gray area and are misused to the point where they lose any real meaning. I'm here to propose a new way of thinking about and categorizing Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks: win condition. To me, there is one question that, based on how a deck answers it, tells me exactly what kind of deck I'm dealing with. And that question is, how does the deck win its games? I've done some thinking, and as far as I can tell, there are 5 ways that a deck can answer that question, which translates to 5 categories of Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks: BS, Beatdown, Towers, Prevent the opponent from playing Yu-Gi-Oh!, and Inevitability. I'll explain. The BS category includes win conditions such as Burn, reducing your opponent's life points to 0 through card effects, Mill, forcing your opponent to run out of cards so they can no longer draw for turn, Hand Rip, removing cards from your opponent's hand via card effects, and other alternate win conditions, Exodia, FA Winners, Phantasm Spiral Assault, and others. These strategies are seldom meta-relevant, but on the rare occasion that they become so, they are so passionately hated by the player base that their key cards get placed on the Forbidden and Limited list immediately. Next up is the Beatdown category. These decks either blind second and win in a single turn, or they go first and set up a defensive strategy with the goal of winning on the crackback. Their win condition is simply to dish out a ton of damage via battle and end the game quickly. Towers is probably the least common win condition in all of Yu-Gi-Oh!, but I include it because there are technically some decks that win games this way. These decks achieve victory by summoning one gigantic boss monster that the opponent simply has no answer for. It's not that they're being floodgated or negated out of all hope of playing, it's just that, for whatever reason, they can't out the Bungus. It's named after Appa Qliphort Towers, the flagship member of this category. Other notable names include Infinitrack Fortress Megaclops, Super Quantal Met King Great Magnus, and Masterpiece the True Draco Slaying King. Next we have the most common, and least healthy, win condition in Yu-Gi-Oh! Preventing your opponent from playing. These decks come in all shapes, sizes, difficulties, and speeds, but all of them have one thing in common. They win by accessing cards that prevent their opponent from successfully playing the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! This category is so common that I've broken it down into 2 subcategories: accessing too many interruptions, and accessing floodgates. The interruption subcategory spends their turn 1s assembling a suite of effects that will either negate, destroy, banish, bounce, spin, or otherwise interrupt anything the opponent attempts to do, leaving them a clear path to win on the following turn. In recent years, this has looked like combo decks assembling boards of big monsters that negate effects. The Floodgate subcategory spends their turn 1s gaining access to powerful singular cards that lock down the game, preventing the opponent from utilizing some core function of Yu-Gi-Oh!, such as special summoning, activating monster effects, activating spell cards, or summoning from the extra deck. These decks can look wildly different in application. Sometimes it's a Mystic Mind deck activating Mind and setting 3 back row. Sometimes it's a Dark Warrior deck going through a 10-minute combo in order to end on number 86 Heroic Champion Rongominiad. Either way, they aim to win by cutting off the opponent's access to some basic aspect of the game, thereby preventing them from playing their strategy optimally. These decks have been around since the early years of Yu-Gi-Oh!, and sadly, I don't think they're going anywhere anytime soon. Last, but not least, is my personal favorite win condition a Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck can have: inevitability. Decks in this category share similar traits with many of the other sections. They do interact with their opponent on their turn, but not to the extent that they prevent them from playing the game. They might be able to amass large amounts of damage quickly, but not so consistently that that is their main win condition. The best way I can describe these decks is this: they outlast you. They will successfully play the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Longer than you can. They often trade 1-for-1 or 1-for-2 interactions, picking away at the opponent's resources while carefully managing their own, slowly overwhelming their opponent in advantage until they can go in for the kill. Some standouts of this category include Burning Abyss, Sky Striker, Salamangreat, Satellar Knight, and Eldritch. Why is Inevitability my favorite? Because when those types of decks face off, both players actually get to play the game they love. Games don't typically end until turn 6 or beyond, and neither deck is completely shutting down the other. There could be massive swings in momentum based on a single top deck, and there's a level of excitement that comes from the fact that either side could win based on which pilot is more skillful. GOAT format is one of the most beloved formats in Yu-Gi-Oh!, and that's due to the fact that all decks from this era play this style of game. It has come back into vogue at other points in Yu-Gi-Oh!'s history, such as Duelist Alliance format in 2014, or TOS format in 2019, and many players would say those have been some of their favorite years of Yu-Gi-Oh! Personally, I know that I always have the most fun when the format is centered around inevitable decks rather than prevent the opponent from playing decks. Even in the less healthy formats, I always try to pick up the deck that plays the inevitability game. Beatdown is a close second though, and I wouldn't fault anyone for saying that those are their favorite decks. Okay, now we've reached the unscripted part of the video where I'm going to show you a list of decks that I've attempted to categorize based on their win conditions. I know I'm going to get a ton of hate for this part, and I welcome the debate. To get ahead of it, I'm going to explain some of what I feel will be the most controversial placements. Bear in mind that I didn't start playing competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Until 2017, so most of these decks I've had to learn about secondhand or watch replays of. Sorry I'm not a Yu-Gi boomer like some of y'all. Alright, here's my list. It is not exhaustive, there's a lot of decks that aren't going to show up here, and there's obviously different versions of decks that have cropped up throughout the years as cards have come out into the playability pool. A deck will shift from maybe being a beatdown deck to an inevitable deck, or interruption deck. They can move about this list. I basically just tried to think, okay, as these decks stick out in players' minds in history for when they were at their peak, or whatever they were at the longest, when you think of this deck, which category should it fall into? Like I said, there's going to be a lot missing, and I might have messed these up. I haven't played all these archetypes, and some of them fall into multiple categories. But anyway, with all the caveats, let's start talking about them. First up, and one of the most controversial, is going to be Trickstar. I know that for as long as Trickstar was meta, there were a ton of Trickstar players who would come to me saying, it's not a burn deck! It's not, I promise, it has other Shut up. Shut up right now. Trickstar, I never saw Trickstar win a game where they didn't do like 3,000 plus burn damage. Yes, it had other plays. Yes, it had the ability to do things that weren't burn. But if it didn't have the burn, it was not winning any of those games. And the other win condition of Trickstar was the Droll Reincarnation hand loop, which I think also fits into this BS section. So yeah, Trickstar is staying right where it is. X-Saber, I don't know anything about the X-Saber meta, but I know Gotham's rips cards out of hand, and I know that Dark Soul searches a bunch in the end phase. You guys can correct me on this one, sorry, I don't know a ton about X-Sabers. Wind-ups. Wind-up Hunter should be banned, Wind-up Carrier should come back. This is not a ban list video, but yeah, I think that was the win condition of Wind-ups. Correct me if I'm wrong. Substitoad. Substitoad led to the Frog FTK. That's definitely BS. That's a burn strategy. Ivagishki Gust Kraken. Yeah, the Gishki hand loop was a hand loop, so that belongs here. Exodia was an alt win condition. Chain Strike, that's a burn deck. Chain burn. Topologic Gumblar Dragon, that's a hand rip deck. Hand Control from like 2004, that's a hand control deck, obviously. Magical Scientist, that's a burn FTK. Yeah, these all belong right where they're at. Moving over to Beatdown. So Dark Arm Dragon is supposed to represent Dad Return and Teledad both. The way I see it, a lot of decks from this era played the beatdown strategy. Like, it would take them a couple turns usually, but if you got access to Dad, you were clearing boards and you were putting up a ton of damage, and it fit better here than really into any other category. Dragon Rulers. So Dragon Rulers turn 1 boards were basically just Draco Sack Pass, maybe an Emptiness if they drew it, and like an Effect Veiler if they drew it, but they weren't setting up a ton of negates or floodgates. They were just like, alright, I'm going to sit here, I'm going to not die, and then I'm going to summon a bunch of dragons next turn and kill you. So that's why I put them here. Heroes have changed a lot over the years. I had to put the one that I knew best, which was just summon a bunch of hero fusions, attack for game. Chaos. So Chaos could very well be in the inevitability category, but I put it here just because the win condition was basically summon CED, nuke the board, attack for game, or burn for game. Grizaris and Glad Beasts. This is a very attack-based deck. It summoned a lot of big boys. Grizaris popped 2, and its goal was just to summon the big boys and attack. Blackwing, so this is like 2009 Blackwing. This is an OTK deck for sure. They love to put up a ton of damage. Dragoonity. Dragoonity hasn't had a ton of competitive success in its history. When the new support comes out in 2021, it would probably fall under the too many interruptions category. But back in the day, in like 2008 Dragoonity, or 2010, you guys can correct me again, I'm not a boomer. I just remember it being known for the Dragoonity OTK. And then Inzectors, never played Inzectors. I know that Dragonfly and Hornet popped a lot of cards. I think their win condition was doing that and then attacking. Cosmo. Cosmo's my favorite archetype in Yu-Gi-Oh! History, and I can confidently say that their win condition is beatdown because we OTK very well. Lightsworn. Lightsworn's win condition is Judgment Dragon, which again, nuke the board, attack for a lot of damage. Troop Dupe Scoop goes without saying. You summon Card Trooper, you activate Machine Duplication, you get a whole bunch of damage on board, you win. Mermail. I believe this was the Ghost second Mermail from like 2013. I know they would make like Abyss Gaios or Dracosat going first, but then again, they would just try to like overwhelm with damage on the crackback. Chaos Dragons. Summon a bunch of really, really big dragons and win. Dinosaur. Summon Ultimate Conductor Tyranno and friends, attack for a bunch of damage and win. Cyber Dragon has to go second just by its nature. Slaps down Cyber Dragon, contact fuses into stuff, makes Omega or makes Infinity. Yep, summon big boys, win. Going down to the prevent the opponent from playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Part of it. Jumping into interruptions. Pepe. This should go without saying. They summoned a bunch of ranked 4s to negate you, and then they would come back at you with more rank 4s, Ignister Prominence, and win with damage. But really their win condition was how many negates they could put up. And I guess if you were going for the Shockmaster variant, you could move it over to the Floodgate area too. Six Sams. Six Sams have been around since like the dawn of time and have come in and out of competition. I just basically had to think of them as the Shien control back when negates were new. And so at the time, that was too many interruptions. Spiral. Spiral would put up like Firewall Dragon, Trigate Wizard, and pops with Spiral Sleeper. So yeah, it was just they interrupted the opponent too many times. The opponent couldn't do anything. Infernity would search out all the copies of Break and Barrier and just interrupt the opponent to death. Pendulum Magician, if it wasn't FTKing you, it was setting up 6 negates. Penned best deck, asked Triff Gaming. Dino Rabbit. Dino Rabbit was really only summoning like 1 or 2 negates at a time, but back then, a Dulka or a Lagia plus a back row was too many interruptions. So, Drytron. Drytron is a brand new deck, still has a long future ahead of it maybe, but currently it's being used to summon things like Herald of Ultimateness and just negate your opponent to death. Adamancipator, that's a 2020 deck. It was a combo deck that summoned a bunch of negates. Dragon Link, a combo deck from 2020 that summoned a bunch of negates, but could also fall into the Floodgates category because they would often go for the extra deck lock with Dragon Buster Destruction Sword. Infernoble Knight, again a combo deck that summoned a bunch of negates. DDD, an insanely difficult combo deck that summoned a bunch of negates, was only meta for like 2 weeks, and then Zoo came out. This is Endymion Pendulum, again, combo deck summoned a bunch of negates. There's a trend here with Pendulum, I'm thinking. Magispector, speaking of, they would search out their spells and traps to negate your stuff or banish your stuff, or Kirin would bounce it back to hand. Again, too many interruptions, that's how they won. Zephyra is another Pendulum deck that would search out traps to try to interrupt you, prevent you from playing. And then Psyframes, this is the meme one. All they do is interrupt. If you just summon and attack, they would really struggle against you. Moving over to accessing floodgates, I put Goki here because the U-Link is a floodgate. That's really all there is to it. Nekroz, I'm going to get hate for this one because a lot of you are going to say, oh, but Nekroz is so skillful, Nekroz... I know, I play Nekroz, and we win games by summoning Unicorn. Shut up. Spellbooks. Spellbooks would use Judgment to get a ton of advantage, but that's not why they won. They won because they summoned Jaugen. And Jaugen is a floodgate. Gravekeepers. Have you heard of Necro Valley? Monarchs. There was an extra deck variant of Monarchs that won through card advantage, and I have a little bit more respect for that one, but Monarchs in their main win condition against like any extra deck was always just putting Domain out. Shaddolls. I love Shaddolls. I wanted to put Shaddolls in Inevitability because they do have a lot of elements of that, but Shaddoll wins games because they summon Winda and Winda sticks. Thunder Dragon, again, has a lot of other elements of an inevitable deck, but they won because they summoned Colossus. Bujins, this is a very easy example. Summon Yamato, activate Kaiser Coliseum, win. Evil Swarm, they would make Ophion, and Ophion countered the format. Virtual World, this is the one that sparked the beginning of the video. Yeah, Virtual World summons VFD, and VFD is a floodgate. Next argument. I will say, though, that when VFD inevitably does get banned, I think Virtual World's going to be fine, and they're going to adapt. They've got a lot of other good cards. Mystic Mine. Rongo Turbo, it summons Rongo Miniad. Mech Knight, I really wish this wasn't true, but Mech Knight, at least in its pure form, wins games because it activates the continuous spells and traps that lock down the board. Guru Control, Guru is very close to being an inevitability. I just put it here because I see Guru winning a lot more games on the back of its floodgates than I do on the back of its interruptions. And Zombie is the same story. It's not all floodgate, but I've yet to see Zombie win a game where they don't have Zombie World up and Rivalry of Warlords or things that are just locking down the opponent. Jumping over to Towers, I talked about a lot of these, but Towers is just you summon a big guy your opponent can't play, or can't out it, really. So you've got Raid Raptor, Ultimate Falcon, Masterpiece. The Scout is meant to represent Cleafort with Towers itself. Infinitrack Fortress Megaclops. If a Zoo player has ever summoned Megaclops and won instantly, you know what I'm talking about. And Super Quantal Met King Great Magnus. Just cards like that. If you just summon it and your opponent says, I can't out that, game 2, you know what I mean. And finally, the inevitable decks. Let's just go through them. You've got Burning Abyss. Obviously, they just don't die. Dante never dies. Zoodiac. So Zoodiac has gone through phases where it's been very fast and very slow, but it's always just been a deck where the worst thing it was doing was putting up a Trident and one other interruption for you. It wasn't negating you to death, it wasn't floodgating you to death, it just played better, amassed card advantage better. ABC, similar story, has a very good card advantage game, very good grind game, and Dragon Buster just banishes one card. I mean, it's not crazy. Totally awesome. So this one could have very well gone into the interruptions category. It just depends on how many traps the Paleo player opens. But yeah, I put it in inevitable because I kind of like the Paleo traps. I feel like, yeah, they interrupt you, but not to an asinine level, and they just come back and they're hard to get rid of. Salamangreat, great example of this one. They would have a Rage, a Roar, maybe a hand trap or two. Nothing crazy, nothing that's going to completely prevent you from playing, and then they'll just out-resource you over time. Sky Striker's similar. When it was full power, they would at most set 3 Widow Anchor. Now it's usually 1 or 2 interruptions, and they just use Ray to stay alive. Over turn after turn, they'll have more cards than you, and they'll eventually win. Traptrix Myrmelio, that's supposed to be Hat. Again, I didn't play in this format, but from what I've been told, that was kind of how it was played. Orcust here is supposed to represent post-Rusty Bardiche ban Orcust, because with that, it was definitely a too many interruptions deck. But after Rusty got banned and it was just Orcust being Orcust, it was a very fair deck. I love the way Dingirsu operates. I really like the resource loop of Orcust. I never played it, but my friends did, and I thought it was perfectly fine. Scapegoat is Goat format, because everybody was an inevitable deck in Goat format. Altergeist, if they don't open the floodgates, they play an inevitable game. If they do open the floodgates, they play a floodgate game. Satellar Knights is a similar story. Different iterations of Satellar Knights would really rely on floodgates, but a lot of times it was just they had really good resource loops, and they would summon Trigger a lot. Gadgets, all the gadgets searched each other, and then they would Ultimate Offering summon. So yeah, just really good resource game, would eventually outgrind you. Prank Kids. Prank Kids at worst is putting up board wipes or heavy storms, and it's usually 1, maybe 2, depending on how well they were able to combo. But I wouldn't say it floodgates you out of the game or interrupts you out of the game. They're just gonna slowly wheedle away at your life points while they do their thing. Madolche, I almost put Madolche in beatdown, but I think Madolche likes to go first. They set up a wall, and maybe they OTK you on the next turn, depending on how bad you opened. But I think really it's just needling away at you, and then eventually they'll be able to make that big push. And then Eldritch. Eldritch is a recent really good example of this. At most, they've got Conquistador popping and Wakero banishing, and the big boy beating. They're not doing a whole lot to you, they're just going to outlast you. In conclusion, I think this is the best way to categorize Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks, and I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Is at its healthiest when it focuses on inevitable decks and beatdown decks. Konami, if you're listening, I'm right.